Chapter 1. The scent of scorched earth clung to the air, mingling with the acrid tang of smoldering metal. Commander Kale Harlan adjusted the filtration settings on his combat suit, the heads-up display flickering as it scanned the ruins. Once a bustling colony, Carthage Prime was now a skeletal wasteland, a graveyard of twisted steel and lifeless soil. Kale crouched beside a shattered transport, brushing ash from a patch of scorched metal. His gloved hand revealed the faint outline of the colony's emblem, an olive branch encircling a globe. The irony wasn't lost on him. Asterisk peace through unity. Isn't that what we all wanted? Asterisk. A faint pulse sounded in his helmet. Commander, Lieutenant Ilya Reyes's voice crackled over the comms. You might want to see this. Kale rose, scanning the horizon. Reyes stood several meters away, her rifle angled toward a cluster of wreckage. Her posture was tense but precise, typical Reyes. She was the kind of soldier who could find calm in chaos, a quality Kale had come to rely on. What is it? He asked, moving toward her. She didn't answer immediately, gesturing instead to a heap of debris that had once been a comms tower. Beneath it lay something alive, or close enough to it. The creature was a grotesque fusion of flesh and machine, its insectoid legs twitching weakly as its carapace emitted faint pulses of green light. Organic tubes threaded through its metallic frame, leaking a viscous black fluid. An Asleal drone, barely clinging to life. Kale's jaw tightened. The Asleal weren't just invaders. They were the universe's perfect predators. Everything they touched, they consumed, adapted, and weaponized. Still breathing, Reyes muttered, nudging the drone's leg with her boot. Well, sort of. Dr. Miranjah's voice chimed in through the comlink. Do not touch it. Kale glanced back as Miran approached, her medskin tablet already active. The scientist had an uncanny ability to seem both fragile and unyielding. Her wiry frame was dwarfed by the environmental suit she wore, but her sharp, focused eyes carried the weight of someone who'd seen too much and refused to flinch. Miran knelt beside the drone, her scanner's holographic display illuminating the twisted amalgamation of circuitry and muscle. It's dying, she said flatly. Good, Reyes said. Not good, Miran snapped, her tone sharper than usual. We need it intact. This thing could hold critical data on their evolutionary patterns. Kale crossed his arms. You think you can extract anything useful? I don't think. I know, she replied, already pulling a syringe-like instrument from her kit. The drone twitched violently as she inserted the probe into its central core. For a moment, its faint bioluminescence flared, and a garbled sound escaped what might have been its mouth, a noise halfway between static and a scream. Kale turned away, scanning the perimeter. The colony's silence was oppressive, broken only by the occasional crackle of collapsing structures. His instincts told him they were being watched. Harlan, Miran's voice brought him back. She stood, clutching a glowing vial filled with a swirling green-black substance. Her expression was grim. This confirms it, she said. Their adaptability isn't just instinctive, it's coded into their biology. They're evolving at a rate that shouldn't be possible. Every skirmish we lose makes them stronger. Kale felt a cold knot form in his gut. An Earth? He asked. Miran hesitated, her eyes meeting his. It's their next target. Reyes cursed under her breath, pacing a few steps before stopping. We don't have the resources for this kind of war. If they hit Earth with the same ferocity as here, they won't just hit Earth, Miran interrupted. They'll consume it, assimilate its technology, its life. Everything we are will fuel their expansion. Kale clenched his fists. Then we can't let that happen. Before anyone could respond, the drone emitted a sharp, high-pitched whine. Miran's scanner lit up with a cascade of warnings. It's sending a signal, she shouted. Kale's instincts kicked in. Reyes, take it down. The lieutenant's rifle barked once, a precise shot shattering the drone's core. The signal cut off, but the damage was done. The ground beneath them rumbled, faint at first, then growing into a steady vibration. Movement! Reyes shouted, her rifle snapping to position. Kale turned to see the horizon come alive. Shadows emerged from the ruins, sleek, spindly forms moving within human precision. More drones. Fall back to the Resolute. Kale barked, drawing his sidearm. Reyes laid down, covering fire as Mirren sprinted toward their transport. Kale followed, his combat suit feeding him telemetry data. Incoming targets, estimated distances, ammunition levels. The drones moved faster, their limbs clattering against debris as they closed the distance. Kale fired off calculated shots, each blast tearing through a drone's carapace. "Mirren's status," he yelled. She dove into the transport's open hatch, securing the vial of extracted material. "Ready?" Reyes was next, her rifle smoking as she leaped aboard. Kale was last, slamming the hatch closed just as a drone lunged toward him, its claws scraping uselessly against the armored hull. "Lift off," he ordered. The transport's engines roared, propelling them skyward. Kale watched through the viewport as the drones grew smaller, their silhouettes blending into the ruins of Carthage Prime. As they broke the atmosphere, Kale leaned back in his seat, his mind racing. They'd survived, but survival wasn't enough. "Not anymore. We have the data," Mirren said softly, breaking the silence. Kale nodded. "Then let's make it count." Above the scorched planet, the stars seemed distant and cold. But Kale knew one thing with certainty. Humanity's fight wasn't over. It was just beginning. Chapter 2. The hum of the Resolute's engines filled the cabin as the transport drifted in low orbit above Carthage Prime. The silence among the crew was oppressive, broken only by the occasional hiss of oxygen recyclers. Kale stood at the holotable, the tactical display casting faint blue light across his face. The vial of extracted substance rested in Mirren's gloved hands nearby, glowing ominously. "We bought ourselves time, but not much," Kale said, his voice tight. "They'll adapt. They always do." Reyes leaned against the bulkhead, her rifle disassembled on the bench beside her. She worked methodically, cleaning the weapon with the precision of someone trying to avoid her thoughts. "We can't outrun them forever," she muttered. "And Earth's defenses? They're a joke compared to what's coming." Kale's jaw tightened. "Then we change the rules." Mirren looked up, her expression skeptical. "Change the rules?" "Kale, these things are literal apex predators. We barely survived that encounter." She gestured to the vial. "This is the closest we've ever come to understanding their biology. But even with this, it's a long shot. Then we make the shot count," he replied, the steel in his voice silencing the room. The holotable flickered, displaying a new feed, encrypted transmissions from Fleet Command. Admiral Chandra's face materialized, her features sharp and uncompromising. "Commander Harlan, your extraction report was unsettling," she began without preamble. Her piercing gaze swept over the team. "Confirm the data you retrieved. Is Earth the next target?" Kale exchanged a glance with Mirren before nodding. "Confirmed. The Asleal are evolving at a rate we can barely track. Every engagement makes them stronger. If we don't act decisively, Earth won't just lose. It'll become another Carthage Prime." The Admiral's expression darkened. "Fleet Command is mobilizing, but we need options, Commander. What's your recommendation?" Kale hesitated, then activated a tactical overlay on the holotable. "We take the fight to them," he said. Reyes straightened, her disbelief evident. "You're suggesting we attack them? Their homeworld?" Mirren interjected, her tone incredulous. "That's suicide. We don't even know where their homeworld is, let alone how to strike it effectively." Kale's gaze didn't waver. "I'm not talking about their homeworld," he said. "I'm talking about their neural nexus, the hub where they process and share adaptive data. Without it, they lose their edge. They become vulnerable." Admiral Chandra's eyes narrowed. "And you know where this nexus is?" Kale tapped the glowing vial. "We think it's encoded in this. If Mirren can crack the data, we'll have a location and a chance to cripple them." Chandra leaned back, her expression unreadable. "You've got 48 hours, Commander. If you can pinpoint the nexus, I'll authorize the strike. But if you fail," she left the threat unspoken. The feed cut off, leaving the cabin eerily quiet. Reyes broke the silence, crossing her arms. "This is insane, Kale. Even if we find the nexus, what's to stop them from adapting to whatever we throw at them? They can't adapt if they're blind, Kale countered. The Nexus is their brain. Without it, they're just drones acting on outdated programming. Mirren frowned. Assuming we survive long enough to hit it, Kale stepped closer, his voice low but firm. This isn't just about survival anymore. It's about making sure humanity doesn't get erased. We've been running from them for too long. It's time we made them run. Mirren sighed, her resolve hardening. Fine, I'll start decoding the data. Kale nodded, watching as she moved to the lab console. Reyes, still skeptical, picked up her rifle, muttering under her breath. Hours later, the cabin's dim lighting seemed to press in on Kale as he stood alone by the viewport. The endless expanse of stars stretched before him, a stark reminder of how small humanity was in the grander scheme. Can't sleep? He turned to see Reyes approaching, her expression softer than usual. Too much to think about, he admitted. Too much at stake. She leaned against the wall, arms crossed. You always carry the weight of the galaxy on your shoulders. You know that, right? Kale smirked faintly. Someone has to. Reyes hesitated, then said, You really believe we can pull this off? Kale's gaze returned to the stars. I have to. If we don't, what's the alternative? Before she could answer, a sharp alarm blared through the ship. Kale! Mirren's voice crackled over the comms. Get to the lab, now! Kale and Reyes sprinted to the lab, where Mirren stood hunched over the console. Her face was illuminated by a cascade of rapidly shifting symbols on the screen. What is it? Kale demanded. I've isolated part of the data, she said, her voice shaking with a mixture of excitement and fear. The Nexus, it's not a single location. It's a fleet. Kale felt his stomach drop. A mobile Nexus? Mirren nodded. It's how they've stayed ahead of us. The Nexus moves with their fleet, adapting in real time to every battle. Reyes exhaled sharply. And where's the fleet now? Mirren pointed to a glowing marker on the map. It was uncomfortably close to Earth. They're already on the move, she said. If we don't act fast. Kale straightened, his mind racing. We got a location. That's all we need. Reyes looked at him, her expression a mix of determination and fear. You really think we can take down an entire fleet? Kale's voice was steady, unyielding. We don't have a choice. The ship's engines roared to life as the Resolute set its course. The fight was no longer about survival. It was about vengeance. Chapter 3. The Resolute emerged from hyperspace, its hull shimmering faintly as it adjusted to the cold void of normal space. Ahead, a field of faint red lights marked the location of the Asleal fleet. Hundreds of vessels, their insectoid silhouettes haunting against the backdrop of stars. Sensor lock established, Mirren reported, her fingers dancing over the console. They're jamming most of the standard frequencies, but I've isolated their formation patterns. Kale stood behind her, his hands braced on the edge of the terminal. Anything on the Nexus? It's here, she replied, her voice strained. Near the center of their formation. But Kale, there's something else. The holodeable flickered, revealing a massive structure at the heart of the fleet, a ship unlike any the team had seen before. Its surface pulsed with an eerie, organic glow, tendrils of energy snaking out like veins through the surrounding vessels. Is that the Nexus? Reyes asked, stepping closer. Mirren nodded. It has to be. I'm picking up biosignatures consistent with their adaptive algorithms. It's like a living brain embedded in their fleet. Reyes let out a low whistle. And we're supposed to take that down? Kale straightened, his gaze hardening. We don't need to destroy the whole fleet. We just need to sever their connection to the Nexus. Without it, they'll collapse. Mirren hesitated, then pointed to the tendrils of energy connecting the Nexus to the fleet. Those conduits, if we can disrupt them, it might force the Nexus to shut down to preserve itself. And how exactly do we disrupt them? Reyes asked, her tone laced with skepticism. Kale activated a schematic of the Resolute. We overload the core. A controlled detonation at close range should be enough to cut their neural network. Reyes froze. You're joking. That's a suicide run. Kale met her gaze, his expression grim. Not if we get out in time. Mirren turned, her face pale. The margin for error would be razor thin. If the timing's off by even a second, then we don't make it, Kale finished. But if we do nothing, Earth falls. Humanity falls. Reyes clenched her fists, her frustration boiling over. Damn it, Kale. There has to be another way. There isn't, he said firmly. We're out of options, Reyes. The weight of his words hung heavy in the air. Finally, Reyes nodded, her shoulders slumping. Fine. But if we're doing this, we're doing it right. No last-minute heroics. No martyr complexes. We all get out alive. The Resolute's engines flared as it closed the distance to the Asleal fleet. The ship's stealth system strained against the enemy's jamming field, the hull groaning under the pressure. Approaching the outer perimeter, Mirren reported, her voice steady despite the tension crackling through the air. Kale stood at the helm, his eyes fixed on the viewport. The Asleal ships loomed larger with every passing second, their surfaces shifting and rippling like living organisms. Energy spike, Mirren called out. They've spotted us? The first barrage hit moments later, pulses of violet energy that streaked across the void. Reyes took control of the ship's weapons, firing countermeasures that detonated in brilliant flashes, disrupting the enemy's aim. Hold them off as long as you can, Kale ordered. I'm trying, but these bastards aren't playing fair, Reyes shot back, her hands flying across the controls. The Resolute weaved through the chaos, dodging incoming fire with sharp, gut-wrenching maneuvers. Kale felt every jolt and shudder as the ship's shields absorbed hit after hit. We're through the perimeter, Mirren announced, closing in on the Nexus. Ahead, the glowing structure loomed, its tendrils pulsing with frenetic energy. The closer they got, the more oppressive the atmosphere became. It was as if the Nexus could sense their presence, its energy rippling with an almost predatory awareness. Get ready, Kale said, his voice calm but commanding. Mirren began the countdown. Core overload initiated. Estimated time to detonation, 90 seconds. The ship's interior lights flickered as the reactor ramped up, the hum of energy rising to a deafening roar. Sever the conduits, Kale ordered. Reyes targeted the glowing tendrils, firing precise bursts of plasma that tore through the connections. Each severed conduit sent a shockwave through the enemy fleet, their formations faltering as the neural network destabilized. 60 seconds, Mirren warned. The Asleal fleet responded with a desperate fury, swarming toward the Resolute in a final attempt to protect their Nexus. We got incoming, Reyes shouted, her voice tight with strain. Kale grabbed the comm, all power to engines. Prepare for emergency ejection. 40 seconds. The Resolute rocked violently as enemy fire tore into its hull. Mirren's console sparked, and she barely managed to shield her face. Systems failing, she reported. We're losing integrity. Keep going, Kale urged. 30 seconds. The Nexus began to writhe, its tendrils retracting as the neural network crumbled. Kale felt a surge of hope. It was working. 20 seconds. We need to eject now, Mirren yelled. Kale slammed the emergency release, and the crew was thrown into their escape pods. The last thing he saw before the hatch closed was the Resolute hurtling toward the Nexus, its core blazing like a star. The pods tumbled through the void, their occupants bracing for impact as the Resolute detonated. The explosion consumed the Nexus in a blinding flash, the shockwave rippling outward and scattering the Asleal fleet. Kale's pod stabilized, the viewport revealing the aftermath. The Nexus was gone, and the enemy ships drifted aimlessly, their movements disjointed and chaotic. He exhaled a shaky breath, the weight of their success sinking in. Status check, he called over the comm. Alive, Reyes replied. Barely. Same here, Mirren added, her voice trembling with relief. Kale leaned back, closing his eyes for a moment. They had done it, but as the silence settled, a nagging question lingered in his mind. Was this victory, or merely a reprieve? Chapter for the silence after the explosion was deafening. Kale's escape pod drifted through the debris field, surrounded by the faint glow of scattered Asleal ships, now aimless without their Nexus. He stared out of the viewport, his chest rising and falling with heavy breaths. The Resolute was gone, a sacrifice that had ensured humanity's survival, but the cost weighed heavily on him. A crackle broke through the pod's comms. "Kale, you still with us?" Reyes's voice was taut, a mixture of relief and urgency. "Barely," he replied, his voice hoarse. "Mirren?" "Here," came the reply, shaky but alive. "Pods are intact. I'm running diagnostics. Minimal damage on my end." Kale allowed himself a brief moment of relief before the cold reality of their situation set in. They were floating in hostile space, their immediate threat neutralized, but rescue was far from guaranteed. "We need to regroup," Kale said, pulling up the pod's limited navigation display. "Reyes, Mirren, ping your locations. We'll converge." As coordinates lit up on his screen, Kale adjusted the thrusters, guiding the pod toward the nearest signal. The pod systems groaned in protest, damaged from the explosion's shockwave, but it held steady. The three pods eventually docked in a battered huddle, their occupants stepping out into the cramped confines of Reyes's pod. The interior was dimly lit, its systems barely operational, but it was enough for them to confer. Reyes leaned against a bulkhead, arms crossed. "So, we did it. The Nexus is gone. But what now? We're sitting ducks out here." Kale rubbed a hand over his face, exhaustion tugging at every word. "The Asleal fleet is in disarray. They won't stay like that forever, but it buys us time. We need to send a distress signal and hope the Alliance picks it up." Mirren frowned, tapping at the pod's control panel. "The jamming field is still active in pockets. It'll take hours to break through, and that's assuming our systems hold out." Kale straightened, forcing the tension from his shoulders. "Then we keep moving. We find a safe zone and transmit from there." Reyes shook her head. "Safe? Out here? You're dreaming." "Then we make it safe," Kale said firmly. His eyes burned with determination. "We didn't come this far, just to die in orbit." The trio worked quickly, patching together a functioning communication array from the three pods' scavenged parts. Mirren's nimble hands darted over exposed wiring, her brow furrowed in concentration. "Almost there," she muttered, her voice a thin thread of focus. Reyes, monitoring the scanners, suddenly stiffened. "Kale? We got company." Kale moved to her side, his jaw tightening as he saw the readings. A cluster of Asleal ships had broken off from the larger fleet and was moving in their direction. "They're still operational?" he asked, his voice sharp. "Not fully," Reyes replied. "Their patterns are erratic. They're acting on residual programming. No strategy, just aggression. Like a wounded animal," Kale said, his mind racing. "They're dangerous, but predictable." Mirren looked up from the panel, panic flickering in her eyes. "We're not equipped for another fight, Kale. The pod systems won't handle even a glancing blow." Kale's gaze hardened. "We don't need to fight them. We just need to outsmart them." As the Asleal ships closed in, Kale executed a desperate plan. He ordered Mirren to overload the remaining power cells in two of the pods, rigging them as decoys. "We'll send the pods out on autopilot," Kale explained, his voice steady despite the mounting tension. "The Asleal will follow the energy signatures, giving us a window to escape." Reyes hesitated. "That's risky. If they see through it." "They won't," Kale cut her off. "They're acting on instinct now. We've seen how they operate without the Nexus. Chaotic, reactive. This will work." With no time to argue, the team launched the decoy pods. The glowing vessels streaked away, their energy readings spiking to draw the Asleal's attention. Kale held his breath as the enemy ships altered course, pursuing the decoys with single-minded ferocity. "They took the bait," Reyes said, exhaling sharply. "Then let's move," Kale said, taking the helm. The remaining pod slipped through the debris field, its movements cautious but deliberate. Mirren worked furiously at the comms array, her fingers a blur over the console. "Signal is clearing," she reported. "I'm patching into Alliance frequencies now." Kale nodded, his eyes scanning the viewport. "Good. Keep it steady." A burst of static crackled through the speakers, followed by a distorted voice. "Unidentified vessel. This is the Alliance frigate Haven's Reach. Identify yourself." Relief washed over Kale like a wave. "This is Commander Kale Thorne of the Resolute. Mission successful. requesting immediate extraction. There was a pause before the voice responded, this time filled with urgency. Commander Thorne, we've been tracking the battle. Stand by for recovery. Reinforcements are en route. Mirren slumped back in her seat, exhaustion overtaking her. Reyes let out a dry laugh, the tension in her shoulders easing for the first time in hours. We made it, she said, almost incredulous. Cale allowed himself a small smile. Not yet, but we will. As the Alliance ships approached, their silhouettes cutting through the void, Cale leaned back in his seat. The battle was over, but the war was far from won. The Asliel might have lost their Nexus, but the threat they posed was still very real. For now, though, humanity had proven its resilience. They had faced an impossible foe and emerged victorious, not because of superior technology or overwhelming firepower, but because of their unyielding will to survive. Cale closed his eyes, the hum of the approaching frigates a soothing promise of safety. Tomorrow, the fight would continue. But today, they had earned their reprieve. The pod jolted as it docked with the Haven's reach, and Cale stepped into the light of salvation.